In previous lectures, we looked at the punctuation marks, the comma, and the semicolon. In this lecture, we will examine the punctuation marks that are used to end a sentence. The first punctuation mark that we want to look at is the period. Periods are used to mark the end of a declarative statement or sentence. For example, James Joyce was an Irish novelist, period. Periods are also used at the end of indirect questions and mild commands. I wonder if there is any milk left. This is a indirect question. It's not a direct question, so we use a period, not a question mark. My mother asked when we are going to visit, period. Again, it's an indirect question. It's not a direct question. When are we going to visit? It's my mother asked. So it's an indirect question. It ends in a period. Or locate Rome on this map. That is a command, but it's not an order. It's a mild command. So again, we would end the sentence with a period, not with an exclamation point. Periods are also used to punctuate some abbreviations. For example, Mrs., Dr., PM, PhD. Note that if we have a sentence that ends with an abbreviation, we should only use one period. For example, take the train that leaves at 4 p.m. PM would have a period because it's an abbreviation, but it's also the end of the sentence. So note that there's only one period after the letter M. Finally, we use the period in several other conventional ways. For example, with numbers, we use a period in American English to indicate a decimal place. For example, 0.01 or $47.07. We indicate the split between the dollar and the cents with a period. Or talking about percentages, 16.8%. Again, we show a decimal place, or 98.6 degrees. Again, we use the period to indicate the fraction, or $15.6 million. Same thing with money indicating a fraction of a whole. We also use literary periods for literary references, such as in biblical verse, Matthew 3.1, or if we're writing a text citation, for example, see section 3.9.8, or when we're citing from a play or a drama, we cite the act, scene, and verses, for example, from King Lear, Act 2, Scene 4, verses 254 to 258. We put a period between the act, the scene, and the line numbers. Finally, we also use the period for email addresses and web addresses to indicate between the nodes. So, for example, tkitty@wvstateu.edu indicates the separation from the type of website or email host, or www.wvstateu.edu. Again, this differentiating between the sections of the URL, we use a period. The next end punctuation mark that I would like to look at is the exclamation point. We use exclamation marks to express surprise, strong feelings, or commands. For example, what an incredibly insensitive remark. We're showing some kind of surprise or strong feeling, perhaps even anger, and that's emphasized by adding the exclamation mark at the end of the sentence. Or, leave me alone. This is not only a command, but it also shows some degree of anger or strong emotion. Or, come here now. You could see that someone in authority is telling someone to immediately drop whatever he or she's doing and come over here right this minute. And that's emphasized again by the exclamation mark. Those are the proper way to use exclamation marks. We should not use exclamation marks together with other punctuation marks. For example, it would be wrong to write, please check your records again, exclamation point followed by a comma, the caller demanded. If we want to use an exclamation mark in this sentence, then we would say, please check your records again, exclamation mark, and then the closed quotation mark. We don't need to have a comma here. The other thing that I think has happened since we've started digital writing is that we've tended to overuse the exclamation mark. Exclamation marks should be used sparingly to really show some kind of surprise or strong feeling or strong command. And we should never use multiple exclamation marks in a row. Such as don't shout with a whole line of exclamation marks after. That's just a sign of immaturity, and it also is not acceptable in proper English. So, again, use the exclamation mark sparingly, only truly when you're expressing a very strong emotion or a command. The next punctuation mark that I would like to look at is the question mark. Question marks are used to end direct questions such as, do you know the way to San Jose? Or a direct quotation, my wife asked, you lost how much money? Note that question marks may be used after questions that appear in the middle of a sentence, such as the example here, Darius, or was it Xerxes, beat the waves to make them obey his command. Note that when a question appears in the middle of the sentence like this, the questions are typically enclosed by parentheses, quotation marks, or dashes. And then finally, we can use a question mark with what would normally be a declarative or imperative sentence to indicate doubt. So if I were to read this sentence as a declarative sentence in which ends with a period, I would say, I have been dead for 2 days. But if I have doubt, I can add a question mark or replace a question mark instead of the period, and then my tone goes up at the end of the sentence to indicate that this isn't a declarative sentence, but rather it's something that I'm expressing doubt about. Have I been dead for 2 days? Another use of the question mark is in a sentence that starts out as a statement but then ends in a question. For example, Hannibal's strategy looked fine in theory, but would it work on the battlefield? Note that with this kind of statement that starts out as a statement but finishes as a question, or in the previous slide, the example where I add a question mark to a sentence that otherwise would normally be a declarative sentence to indicate some expression of doubt. These two examples should not be confused with the indirect question. An indirect question should always end with a period. Example of an indirect question. The Roman general Varro wondered whether Hannibal's strategy would succeed. This is an indirect question, so it ends in a period. If it were a direct question, it would be written such as, will Hannibal's strategy succeed? Or if it were a question within a statement where we use dialogue, we could write, Varro wondered, quote, will Hannibal's strategy succeed? Question mark, close quote. Then we have a question within a statement. We should also use question marks to indicate a series of queries within the same sentence. For example, what did you eat for lunch? Pizza? A salad? Nothing? Use question marks to indicate that a name, date, or fact cannot be established with certainty. For example, Hannibal, 247 question mark to 183 BC, was a military tactician. The question mark after 247 indicates that we don't know exactly when Hannibal was born, that 247 BC is an estimate of the date that he was born. Note, however, that you shouldn't use the question mark to indicate that you're unsure of facts that would be available with more research. The above means no one knows when Hannibal was born, not I don't have time to look up when Hannibal was born. While strictly speaking, a colon isn't an end punctuation, it does, like the semicolon and the comma, sometimes function to end an independent clause, as we'll see. So we should use the colon to introduce a series of examples or a list of items. Note, as I said, the colon normally must be preceded by an independent clause. There is an exception when introducing a list or statement with just a phrase or topic word such as example or note. So an example here. In a large bowl, beat together the following ingredients, colon, eggs, oil, white sugar, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla. Note that the content preceding the colon is a complete independent clause. In a large bowl, beat together the following ingredients. We should also use the colon to introduce a long formal statement, quotation, or question. For example, we recall Dirty Harry's memorable challenge, colon, go ahead, make my day. Again, the content before the colon, we recall Dirty Harry's memorial challenge, is a complete sentence. Here we have a few more examples of when we would use the colon. We would use the colon after a salutation in a business letter. Dear Dr. Kitty, colon. Now again, there's the content before the colon is not a complete sentence because this is just a salutation in a letter, but it does end the salutation. So in this case, we could consider it a ending punctuation mark. Likewise, we would use a colon between a title and a subtitle of a book. For example, College English, colon, the first year. Again, the colon is expressing the end of something. It's not the complete sentence before the colon, but it's indicating the end of the title, and then the next words are the subtitle of the book. Finally, we have an example where we use a colon between a chapter and the verse in a biblical reference. For example, Genesis 46.3, which indicates a separation between the chapter 46 and verse 3. Now, those of you that were paying attention will say, hey, wait a minute. A few slides previously, you said that we can use a period between the chapter and verse. And that's true. So what's going on here are different style guides. It's in some style guides preferred to use a colon in a biblical reference, and in some style guides it's better to use a period, or a period is required. So we need to, as always, be aware of what style we're following. And if we don't have a style guide that we're following, then we can make up our rules as long as they're within the bounds of what's acceptable. But then we need to be consistent in the rest of our document. So if we decide to use a colon between the chapter and verse, then we would consistently use a colon throughout any document that we were writing. One final use of the colon, which we've already seen from when we were discussing the use of numbers, is to use a colon to separate the hours from the minutes in time references, such as 20:04 or 8:04 p.m. We also note here a few places where we should not use a colon. For example, we should not use a colon between a preposition and its object. It would be incorrect to write Greek coleslaw consists of colon, shredded cabbage, oil, vinegar, salt, and pepper. Here, in this case, someone is probably thinking, oh, what follows the preposition of is a list, so let me introduce the list with a colon. The problem, of course, is that the content before the colon is not a complete sentence. Greek coleslaw consists of. That is not a complete sentence, so we cannot introduce the list with a colon. Now, had I written as in the third example here, Greek coleslaw consists of the following. Now I've got a complete sentence preceding the colon, and I can use a colon followed by a list: shredded cabbage, oil, vinegar, salt, and pepper. But probably the best way to write this sentence is to use no punctuation at all. Just keep the of, the preposition, and then the objects following the preposition are the objects of the preposition. So the best sentence here is Greek coleslaw consists of shredded cabbage, oil, vinegar, salt, and pepper. Another place where we should not use a colon is after a verb, after the word that, or after expressions such as. Again, we do not. The confusion comes from usually a list that is following the colon, but in most cases, unless the material preceding the colon is a complete sentence, we do not need a colon. Our kids play football, basketball, and baseball. These are just objects of the verb, so we don't need punctuation here. We just write our kids play football, basketball, and baseball without any punctuation after the verb.